If you enjoy my work, please consider supporting me on my Patreon or on my Buy Me a Coffee page. The links to both websites are in the description of this video. Some time ago, I decided not to do sequel videos, since they usually do not get that much traction. Nevertheless, I decided to make an exception in the case of my last video regarding the issue of remigration. This video is thus an extension of my previous video. If you have not watched it and are interested, please do so first. The video made quite an impact, at least in the very modest context of my channel. It raised a lot of disagreement, and it was even brought to my attention that a certain quite large X account posted a dismissive tweet aimed at the video's message. That is great. I'm all for it. It enhances the exposure to the channel, raises a debate, and I do not mind being disagreed with, nor do I claim to hold some sacred source of truth. Only the part about the reputation of the Austrian painter being rehabilitated... well, I didn't even know that Gustav Klimt was cancelled to begin with. But many of the criticisms certainly might have a lot of merit, and many of the ideas brought up were quite interesting and worth discussing. In some cases, I felt the need to develop some of my arguments from the previous video more, to get the desired point across. So, I decided to do a follow-up video, where I will go over some of the criticisms that were reoccurring or that caught my attention as plausible. I will do it by examining two very interesting case countries, Saudi Arabia and Denmark. An odd couple, to say the least. The first thing to address is that I never claimed that mass deportations or remigration are physically impossible. I am aware of the existence of planes and boats that are used to take people from one place to another. My point was that I am firmly convinced they will not happen in the context of contemporary Europe. The context is absolutely crucial. Different societies throughout the world operate under vastly different social, political, economic, and civilizational frameworks. In this context, one of the most prominent comments under the video brought up an important point. Specifically, that Saudi Arabia realized mass deportations of millions of people in the past years. That is indeed true, and it does not concern only Saudi Arabia, but also other Gulf petromonarchies operating under similar socio-economic models, like Kuwait or the United Arab Emirates. These mass deportations of truly staggering numbers of people are happening relatively often in these neck of the woods. So yes, if one is looking for an example that such an operation can be undertaken in the context of the contemporary world, you can find one. However, if one thinks that this example showcases that European countries will anytime soon be able to imitate such an operation, I believe it is good to analyze it a little more. In terms of developed countries, there likely isn't a state that would be as far removed from contemporary Europe's social, political, and civilizational context as Saudi Arabia. It is an absolute monarchy with theocratic and possibly semi-totalitarian tendencies that is, although it is rather spectacularly trying to change this, still completely dependent on the export of hydrocarbons. Oil alone accounts for approximately 40% of Saudi GDP and 75% of fiscal revenue. In combination with substantial natural gas exports, it is likely even more. It is also a highly militarized state, with 7.2% of its GDP being used for military purposes in 2022, which is substantially higher percentage than Russia paid that year, even though it waged a massive war in Ukraine. Saudi Arabia is a country that runs a highly specific social model, in which it is entirely dependent on foreign labor, since its native population basically does not work. Women mostly do not work for cultural reasons, and 70% of Saudis that are employed work government jobs that very often do not really entail much actual work. The Saudis themselves have estimated that many Saudi state employees work for about an hour a day. Quite a life. This model also encompasses the military structures of the state, which are heavily dependent on foreign mercenaries. More than that, the demographic profile of Saudi Arabia is entirely different than in Europe, with 63% of the population being under 30 years and 42% being foreign nationals. These almost 13 million foreign nationals, an incredible number when you take into account the fact that the population of Saudi Arabia is 32 million, are basically of two kinds. A highly educated workforce from all over the world and low-skilled workers from poor countries, mainly from the broader Muslim world, but also from India or Ethiopia. It is rather a bizarre socio-demographic model. The House of Saud keeps its citizens materially satisfied with the oil money, guaranteeing a high standard of living, and internal political stability is also enforced by the large-scale deployment of security forces. You do not want to be in opposition to the state in Saudi Arabia, since you could end up being tortured, imprisoned, and likely even killed very quickly. The massive clampdown on immigration was done to decrease the staggering number of foreigners in the country, which peaked at almost 15 million in 2016. The vast majority of deported people were illegal immigrants who came from Yemen and countries in the Horn of Africa, like Ethiopia and Somalia. These people were usually transported by planes from Saudi Arabia to their home countries, where the sudden relocation of hundreds of thousands of people often created somewhat of a humanitarian crisis. In the previous video, I talked a lot about the fact that European countries have major trouble getting the source countries of immigration to accept the deportees. It is the most common reason for the failure to enforce deportation orders. That does not seem to be an issue at all for the Saudis. I was trying to figure out why. The case of Yemen is specific, since Yemen actually has a very long land border with Saudi Arabia and is in a state of a very bloody and protracted civil war in which the Saudis are one of the major players. So, this situation falls under the criteria of having a land border and existing in a context of heightened chaos and violence occurring during military conflicts. In the case of Somalia and Ethiopia, it is hard to say. Probably, it is just the sheer muscle that Saudi Arabia can flex in the region, due to being a major military and economic powerhouse, combined with the balls and ruthlessness required to do so, and the fact that Ethiopia and Somalia likely just do not have many options of preventing it, otherwise than protest it, which they did. Now, my point from the previous video about possible international repercussions for Europe from the Gulf countries in the case of mass deportations of millions of people might sound strange in this context. Wouldn't that be blatant hypocrisy? Well, it would. That does not mean that it would not happen. Maybe the claim that they might reduce the export of oil and gas into Europe is far-fetched, since that would hurt their interests as well. I was trying to point out the fact that people need to be aware that Europe is now operating in a world in which its weight is incomparable to the previous centuries, and that the opinions of the rest of the world need to be taken into account. When you check the coverage of immigration to Europe by Al Jazeera, the Qatar-based state-funded media corporation, you can clearly see their coverage is very close to the pro-immigration liberal European media, stressing out the tragic deaths of immigrants and the allegedly cruel approach of European governments and whatnot. The fact that the Gulf petromonarchies did not accept any refugees themselves did not bother them in the slightest. The large Muslim communities in Europe are a foreign policy asset for them. They have an interest in not losing this asset, and they are much more ruthless, pragmatic, and unapologetic than Europe when it comes to pursuing their interests. As I said before, the world does not fear Europe. It is, of course, important to note that there is likely almost no opposition within the Saudi society to these measures whatsoever. And even if there was, the Saudi leadership does not have to care due to the authoritarian nature of the regime. They do not have to deal with the self-imposed legal restrictions on how the migrants are treated. The concept of refugeehood does not exist in the legal system of the Gulf states. They do not care about the nagging of human rights-oriented NGOs. They do not care about the impact of liberal media coverage on public opinion. And there are no meaningful international repercussions in the case of the Horn of Africa states. Now, if this existing opposition in Europe was overcome and silenced, which sure, it could happen. Maybe the European countries could borrow some tricks from the Saudi playbook. In the case of some impoverished African countries like Somalia, they probably could forcefully unload tens of thousands of people there, whether the Somali government would like it or not. But in the case of many countries, this would be unworkable. You cannot do that with Turkey or Iran. It is very questionable if you could do that with countries like Iraq or Pakistan. Sure, Pakistan is a very poor country, but it is also a country with 240 million people and nuclear weapons. The Gulf countries can deport people to Pakistan. Still, Pakistan also depends on their energy exports for its functioning and has a dense cultural, trade and military ties with the Gulf countries overall. In the case of Maghreb countries, which are source countries of some of the largest European immigrant communities, there is quite a complex relationship that includes both energetic ties to Europe and efforts to mitigate new waves of immigration from Africa. European governments won't enact drastic unilateral actions that could dramatically worsen these relationships. Now, I also realized another essential point when researching the Saudi situation. To get into Saudi Arabia, the illegal migrants most often go through the southern Saudi border with Yemen. The Saudi border protection enforcement organs do not play. They try to enforce border control in a way that is yet unimaginable in Europe, which includes shooting hundreds of Ethiopians and other migrants trying to cross into Saudi Arabia. If the migrants get into the country, they are definitely not living off welfare there. They very often live and work in appalling conditions that many do not hesitate to call modern-day slavery. Even the legal migration operates under the so-called kafala system, in which the workers must have an in-country sponsor, usually their employer, who is responsible for their visa and legal status. This practice has been criticized for creating easy opportunities for the exploitation of workers, as many employers take away passports and abuse their workers with little change of legal repercussions. And these are the legal immigrants, so the situation of the illegals is likely significantly worse. You may remember the news stories about the deaths of foreign laborers working in Kuwait when it was preparing for the Football World Cup. So, if you try to illegally get into Saudi Arabia, you have to get there through an actual war zone in Yemen, the border control might shoot you, and then you will likely live in some crowded room with no air conditioning and 20 other people in it, and you will work some back-breaking job. All of that while being under constant threat of deportation, which often includes the confiscation of all the money they saved when working in Saudi Arabia. And yet, hundreds of thousands of people still try to achieve precisely that. That's how bad the life prospects of young men are in many underdeveloped African or Asian countries. That is important due to another point that a lot of people raised. Migrants should be heavily incentivized to leave Europe voluntarily by cutting the welfare, abolishing dual citizenship, uncompromising assimilationist policies, and overall a tough approach towards those who arrive in Europe. I agree with this opinion. It should be done. However, when one looks at the Saudi Arabian case, it is important not to underestimate the sheer level of motivation that these people have and not to stay in their countries of origin. I read a lot of stories of sub-Saharan African immigrants that reached Europe. Let me tell you, whatever one might think of immigration, most of the people who arrive from Africa specifically have seen some shit. The route through Africa, the Sahara Desert and the Mediterranean is not some backpacking trip. Those people are much tougher and have much more active survivalist instincts than we do. They usually paid all of theirs and sometimes their family possessions to the traffickers and then literally risk their lives traveling through the desert and the sea. The traffickers, usually Arabs, do not care. They will leave them to die if anything goes wrong. I think it is far from certain that a demographically significant chunk of the people would just leave if their lives were made significantly less pleasurable. The choice would have to likely be rather binary. Either you will leave, or you will go to jail for years. The vast majority of these people won't leave Europe voluntarily, only by force. In this regard, the Danish model is worth analyzing. Denmark has the strictest illegal immigration policy in Western Europe, and possibly the whole Western world. Denmark is not bound by the EU law when it comes to issues of immigration and asylum, since it has negotiated an opt-out from the legal acts regulating these issues. It thus has a significantly freer range of operation. Danish immigration policy has been gradually tightening since the 1980s, but especially since 2015, when the European refugee crisis coincided with the electoral success of the anti-immigration Danish People's Party. Interestingly, the hardline approach towards immigration was adopted by the main left Social Democratic Party, which then won 2 consecutive elections in 2019 and 2022 and gradually wiped out the Danish People's Party from the political map. It is interesting in several ways. Traditionally, before the inner cultural changes within the political left sort of transformed its ideological background, the leftist parties were usually the most opposed to mass immigration. They knew that their electorate would be badly affected by it, since they were usually highly interconnected with labor unions and saw immigration as a threat to the wages of the working class. That has gradually shifted since then, and the leftist parties today are, on average, significantly more open to immigration than the parties on the right. It is likely not a coincidence that the influence of social democratic or other mainstream center-left parties has been in steep decline throughout the continent. However, the Danish Social Democratic Party is one of the outliers in this regard. Their arguments against mass immigration are centered around the sustainability of the highly praised Danish welfare state, which could be threatened by the unmitigated inflow of migrants that would take more out of the system than they would contribute in. That is precisely what the Danish Ministry of Finance discovered when researching the issue. So, what do their policies look like? The integration of foreigners is primarily defined by their functioning in the labor market, and residence permits are conditioned by economic self-sufficiency and knowledge of the Danish language. Various measures have heavily restricted the access to citizenship. For any refugees or people who came to Denmark through the means of family reunification, intensive Danish language courses and acceptance of job offers provided by municipalities are mandatory in order to receive any social benefits or to get a residence permit. But most importantly, the Danish government has been absolutely bullish on not accepting almost any refugees or asylum claimants and dissuading them from coming to Denmark by every possible means. In 2015, the government purchased advertising space in Lebanese newspapers, detailing new rules for refugees, a 50% reduction in social benefits for new refugees, and 1-year delay in applying for family reunifications. This policy was intended to discourage asylum seekers from applying to Denmark. The possibility of confiscating property belonging to asylum seekers was introduced to cover the costs of the procedure and accommodation. This law, often referred to as the jewelry law, transfers the financial responsibility for the arrival of their family members under family reunification to the refugees, whereas the Danish state has previously been responsible for this. Denmark has also started to treat the asylum claimants who are accepted as only temporary residents. They are not expected to stay in the country permanently, only until their country of origin is safe again. That was highlighted by the decision of the Danish government that certain parts of Syria, including Damascus, are now again safe, and the refugees from these areas previously accepted by Denmark should thus return. However, it is important to note that since Denmark does not recognize the Syrian government, nobody was actually forcefully returned to Syria. The voluntary returns of immigrants are heavily incentivized by financial compensations. The Danish government also implements a strategy to tackle the so-called ghettos, residential areas where a large number of people of non-Western background is concentrated and that are problematic in terms of crime or unemployment. Such residential areas should be broken up, and the concentration of people of non-Western backgrounds should not exceed 30%. Overall, the Danish immigration policy is very based, well thought out, and highly effective in achieving its means. Specifically, it dramatically reduces the number of asylum claimants trying to reach Denmark, and, to a lesser extent, overall immigration. Between 2014 and 2019, the total number of asylum applications fell by 82%, from 14,700 to 2,700. The number of foreigners, excluding asylum seekers, entering Denmark over the same period has fallen by 14%, from 49 to 42,000. But it is also fair to acknowledge that the success of the Danish model is, to a certain extent, caused by the fact that other European countries have not adopted such measures. And Denmark can thus benefit from the fact that it is surrounded by states with much more benevolent policies, like Germany. Unless you have your whole family in Denmark or are heavily into Lego, applying for asylum in Denmark does not make much sense when you can do it in Germany or Sweden. On the pan-European level, the effect would likely be less pronounced. We can reasonably presume that Denmark is an example of a wealthy Western European country that managed to reach some level of societal consensus on a rigorous approach towards illegal immigration, turned this social consensus into coherent policy measures, and then deployed all the strength of its undoubtedly competent executive branch into realizing this policy. And yet, no significant remigration is taking place in Denmark. I had autistically nerded out the Danish governmental statistics on immigration when researching this video. I pulled out the statistics on the number of migrants and their descendants from non-Western countries between 2019 and the end of the 2023. What the Danish government has achieved is a rather impressive full stop on new undesirable immigration. When you look at the most prominent non-Western source countries of immigration into Denmark, specifically Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Pakistan, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Iran, Somalia and Afghanistan, also countries the perpetrators of violent crime in Denmark most often hail from, even though in different order, you will find out that in all the cases there was either a very slight increase or a very slight decrease, usually in hundreds of people. Basically, all of them remained stagnant, and the number of descendants of people from these countries, so children or minors with at least one parent from these countries of origin, have increased in all cases. For example, while the number of people born in Syria living in Denmark decreased from 35,800 to 34,900 people, the number of descendants of Syrians increased from 6,600 to 10,000 at the same time. Denmark has basically realized that if it does not want to go the Swedish way, it needs to act, while it is still a relatively homogeneous nation in the Western European context, being 83% ethnically Danish, and over 90% ethnically European. But the already existing diversity in Denmark is not going anyway. More than that, Danes do not seem to really care about it that much anymore. Research shows that in the last couple of years, immigration declined from being the second most pressing issue on the minds of Danes, only after climate change, to being 8, with only 3% of the Danish population saying that immigration is an issue that the government should address first, at the end of the 2022. The Danish policy is clearly working in this regard. That is important in relation to my point from the previous video about the internet opinion bubbles people tend to get submerged in. One of the comments under the previous video said the following, quote, "If the comment section is any indication of the way history is going, I'm not sure it'll be permanent." Well, that's the thing. The comment sections of my videos are absolutely not any indication of where history is going. Don't get me wrong, I'm infinitely glad for my viewers. You allow me to do this whole thing. But it is clearly a very specific demographic strata. The vast majority of my viewers are males between 18 and 34 years of age from Western countries that are highly concerned with mass immigration and ethnic change, and are, on average, likely on the relatively far right end of the political spectrum. But even if the general population is clearly getting increasingly concerned with immigration, and the governments will have to react to this shift, I would say that the average voter is not dreaming about a drastic, whatever it takes, violent governmental action to restore the previous ethnic homogeneity. That would make him feel very uncomfortable rather quickly. He wants to feel safe on his streets. He wants his surroundings to not change rapidly every year in terms of ethnicity and culture, and he wants not to see his taxes being wasted on welfare for people who do not exhibit much willingness to integrate into society. If less drastic measures could achieve this, they would be preferred. The governments of Europe should, and many likely will, try to move closer to the Danish model. And yes, the successful deportation rates might increase, even significantly, but some kind of Saudi Arabia-style action is very, very unlikely. There are debates within the European Union about improving the deportation rate. The EU is moving towards conditioning any receivement of developmental aid, of which it is a generous provider, by accepting deportations, or restricting visa policy towards uncooperative countries. Greece has proposed straight-out economic sanctions on countries like Pakistan or Iran that refuse to accept their citizens. The German government is allegedly working on backroom deal with Iraq to improve the deportation rate. All these policies might bear fruit, but one should not expect Europe to pull out something like Saudi Arabia. Ultimately, this debate is a lot about what exactly we imagine under the term remigration. Some people have pointed out that remigration is primarily about getting rid of the worst cases, the bad apples, and could numerically take the shape of deporting of 200,000 or 300,000 people in the German context. If all the right internal and external issues click, this is likely viable. But if people think there will be some great rehomogenization of European populations, that is a completely different story. It is important to face the music in terms of demographic data. 300,000 people is nothing in the grand scheme of German demographics. Many people have disapproved of the term permanent I used in the thumbnail of the previous video. Nothing is permanent. Well, yeah, nothing lasts forever. Everything that has a beginning has an end. But I am not talking about what will happen in 2453. In terms of immediate future, that concerns us all, it is permanent. The black hole in the middle of all these issues is the fact that Europe is a continent that has had a deeply deficient birth rates for 40 or 50 years. And it is surrounded by regions with massive demographic surpluses. In this regard, the great migratory flows of the past decades are much less like the often given examples of the Balkans under the Ottomans or the Caliphate of Cordoba, and much more like the great migratory period between 300 and 800 AD. When massive amounts of people change their location due to the coexistence of a large number of factors. While the overall ethnic balance within Western European countries is usually around 85% European, you need to consider that this balance is inflated by the massive prevalence of natives among the largest boomer generations. The number of people of non-European background among people older than 50 is usually less than 10%, but among children under 10, it is closer to 30%. That is, quite literally, the future. People often say it is rubbish to say remigration cannot be done, and it is all just a matter of will. Well, I cannot agree completely, since there are factors independent of the will of European political leadership, such as the aforementioned international issues. But sure, it is a lot about will. Well, do you believe? I mean, truly believe to the extent that you would be willing to bet your hard-earned money on it. That there will be a will to forcefully deport, let's say, 15 or 20% of the children currently growing up in some Western European country? If yes, I have to respectfully disagree. If not, then it is permanent. One viewer wrote in the comments that the video has a normalcy bias. I understood it as a way of saying that I base a lot of my arguments on certain currently valid predispositions that might, however, change drastically in the future, and a lot of those predispositions might thus become invalid. I understand where this is coming from, and it is true to a certain extent, but it is also good to remember then when predicting some unexpected and revolutionary future scenarios, people often expect these changes to lead precisely to the ends they expect or wish for. But that is far from certain. The level of complexity involved in predicting such future scenarios is more than anyone can compute within his mind. To give some examples of what I mean by that, people often claim that some kind of complete economic breakdown or maybe a military conflict within Europe might change the circumstances to a point when the public will radicalize, all the internal hurdles and the opposition will be crushed, there will be large-scale voluntary remigration, and the regimes will become much more ruthless in pursuing something like mass deportations. Well, it might. But many other things might happen as well. For example, some kind of massive economic breakdown might radicalize populations. Still, it also could, on the elementary level, make Europe much weaker and less significant on the international scale, and thus decrease its ability to persuade countries to accept deportees. Saudi Arabia is, after all, acting from the position of strength against the source countries when it deports hundreds of thousands of people. And while some large military conflict might radicalize and militarize the population as well, deporting a third of the militarily eligible population is definitely not a first instinct of countries in times of war. A couple of days ago, there was a news story from Germany. The German defense minister considers letting foreigners in the Bundeswehr to help with the low recruitment success rate. As a reward, they could get German citizenship. So, it is important not to model future scenarios according to one's wishes. It can go many different ways. And as always, it is important not to underplay the influence of demographics on the likelihood of some form of regime change or revolution. Native European populations are approaching the average age of 50, are almost completely armless, and the vast majority of people under 40 did not experience any military training at all in their lives. In my opinion, the only viable option in this regard is a military-led coup, in which the armed forces decline the obedience to the civil political power. However, in most Western European countries, with the notable exception of France, militaries are not robustly funded societal institutions enjoying high levels of public trust and prestige, and are fully and unconditionally subordinated to the civil political leadership. Overall, I believe that even if the Overton window and the elementary conditions might change, it is far more likely that Europe will become like Denmark than that it will become like Saudi Arabia.